This is a short introduction to organizational development and the concept of a learning organization. Organizational development is a whole field that grew out of the field of adult learning. So it's a relatively new field, just like the field of adult learning is also relatively new. The original motivation for organizational development was to increase productivity in a business. The idea being that if we can teach individuals within an organization to learn better, that'll increase productivity, but also that'll increase collectively the capacity for the organization to improve and develop. Early on, there was this question, can an organization learn? And the answer is definitely yes. Similar to an individual, the organization, like an organism, can learn and can develop. Organizational development really grew out of this increasing complexity. Business complexity has multiplied sixfold since 1955, as was cited in Fullen and Gallagher. And in the 70s and 80s, that's when organizational development theories really started taking off, similar to adult learning. There's a lot of theory laid down during that time. More recently, this concept of the VUCA world is spoken of a lot in organizational development. VUCA being an acronym standing for volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. That really describes our world these days. So how do we learn, and how do organizations learn in this sort of a world? Well, organizational development really took off as a field in 1990 when Peter Senge came out with a book called The Fifth Discipline about the learning organization. It built on this concept of complexity and how complexity was changing how people learn and how organizations need to operate. Here's the quote from the opening pages. As the world becomes more interconnected and business becomes more complex and dynamic, it is no longer sufficient to have one person learning for the organization. It's just not possible any longer to figure it all out from the top and have everyone else following the orders of the grand strategist. So organizational development at this point became not just about instrumental learning. How can we get adults in an organization to learn these techniques or to learn how to make widgets better or faster? But how can we really develop and transform, because the world was changing and it was changing quickly. So there was really this conceptual change in how organizations need to be structured in order for people to thrive and learn. And I want to stress that this isn't just talking about learning like a formal learning or classroom learning or professional development. Senge and others are talking about how an organization can be set up so people are learning informally or learning from their day-to-day activities with one another. 70 to 80% is estimated of our learning is actually informal learning. Very little of it comes from formal learning. So this other quote that I have up here is a more recent quote. A learning organization is a place where people can thrive and allow their individual and collective greatness to emerge. So as organizational development has grown as a field, it's merged with another field that's fairly new, which is positive psychology. Positive psychology really looks at what makes people work when things are going well. How can we be the best people that we can be? So what is this learning organization? What does it mean? 3 of its main features are the following. Teams are the engine of learning, where diverse individuals can pool their perspectives and creativity. A second feature of a learning organization is a flattened hierarchy for decision making. And a third is that individuals and teams have capacity for complex thinking. So let's look at complex thinking. Senge spoke of the shift that needed to happen in the way people viewed the world, viewed themselves, their sense of understanding complexity. In this chart, modern is at the top of the left column, and postmodern or integrated is at the top of the right. And this is a simple demonstration of the shift of worldview that people need to make in order to learn in a more integrated manner. In the left column, if you look at some of the words, the shift is going from thinking of an industrial mechanistic model of the world that has everything separated into parts and thinking more in wholes and thinking more in interconnectedness. The postmodern or integral worldview is more relational, where everyone is interconnected and reality is constructed. There is not just one true reality. So the shift in thinking is demonstrated nicely by this quote by Albert Einstein: "No problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it." So when we think about some of the problems in education or in business or in the world right now, there's so much focus and on trying to solve problems, just as Einstein says, with exactly the same worldview or same paradigm of thinking as those problems were created. It's very challenging for us to see our blind spots, to understand our assumptions that we're making, and to shift our way of seeing things, to do things differently. And ultimately, organizational development ended up becoming this field about consciousness and psychology and raising the level of consciousness amongst people and amongst humanity. School districts are not naturally inclined to be learning organizations, something that we will talk about more. Leadership is always a big topic in organizational development. Really, we're all leaders in a learning organization. And there are 5 disciplines that Peter Senge spoke of that a leader portrays or holds or develops within a learning organization. They are personal mastery, mental models, shared vision, team learning, and systems thinking. So we'll look at these one at a time. Personal mastery. In a learning organization, each individual, particularly the leader, has a reflective disposition. So this means the leader's always examining his or her underlying assumptions, always checking for blind spots and learning and developing. And shown here is the experiential learning cycle, which is a theory laid down by David Kolb in 1984. Very simple if you look at it. You can start with experience in the upper right. And once we have an experience, we don't necessarily learn from that experience unless we reflect on it, look at it a little bit deeper, and then conceptualize it. In other words, put it into words. And then once we put it into words, then that helps us learn from it and adapt. And then that leads to more experiences. And the cycle goes round and round as we learn. So the idea with personal mastery is that it's very aspirational. This quote by Nelson Mandela: "You can't change society unless you change yourself." So leaders, especially who want to be leaders of a learning organization, are very reflective people who are constantly working on self-awareness and self-improvement. This particular model shows that the leader is constantly working on personal development, and with time, that they really cannot make an impact on their organization or society at large unless they're continually developing themselves. The next discipline is mental models, and this is simply understanding that the way I see one event might be completely different than the way somebody else experiences the exact same event. One person might jump for joy, another person might think their life is miserable under the exact same circumstances. But it's a little bit more complex than that. It's also this understanding that as people learn and develop, they can increase their perspective and their worldview changes. So here's one model of, at the simplest, a person is just focused on their basic needs. And then as they become a little more complex, they think about others and their relationships with other people. And then as they become yet more complex, they think about things in terms of philosophy and theories and values, and that's what they stand by. And oftentimes we'll be talking or trying to express a concept to another person. Perhaps a teacher is trying to express a concept to a parent. And if the parent has a very different worldview or mental model, the two are just not going to be able to connect. And that's why it's so important in education to meet people where they're at and try to understand what their mental model is and what their level of development is. Team learning is another discipline. In the learning organization, the team is the engine of development, meaning there's all these teams that have a lot of executive decision-making abilities. They, within a team, are leading themselves. They're doing and they're measuring and being accountable for themselves. And this leads to fast developmental learning. Also, shared purpose. What motivates each team is a sense of purpose, that each team has this aim, and that's the energy that fuels everybody. So the idea of a learning organization is that there isn't this top-down hierarchy where everybody is just fueled by external motivation, punishments and rewards, but it's this internal motivation and a shared purpose and higher aspirations are what motivate. Systems thinking is a miniature presentation of its own, so we're going to end this discussion of organizational development right here, and there'll be a second screencast that's just on systems thinking.